she does. Okay, well, we'll call the meeting. It's 2:30, finance meeting, Tuesday, November 8th. Nice blustery day outside. Committee and public comments. Please.
Okay, I'm on. Hello? Yes, you got me. Okay. All right, Michael Neal. I have a comment to make concerning the fact that this rate study document has only been available as of right at this moment, which is, I know, a number of pages. There's no possible way that I can look through that, digest that intelligently, and engage in the discussion. So I'd like to remind the committee, under the Brown Act, there's a section, it's 54957.5B, that addresses this requirement for all bodies. And this is a publicly noticed committee meeting, so they are subject to the provisions of the Brown Act in full. And let me get up here where I can read it. So it says, writings, except for records exempt from disclosure under certain section of the Act, distributed to all or a majority of the members of a legislative body for discussion or consideration at a public meeting are disclosable to the public. It says, upon request shall be made available without delay in accordance with provision of section 54957.5. If the materials are provided prior to a meeting, they should be made available upon request. It goes on at the end of the paragraph, although it says, if materials are distributed to the members of the body by the agency at the meeting, the materials should be available to the public at that time as well. Materials provided at the meeting by a person who's not a member should be made available to the public at the conclusion of the meeting. Now, that's just a small part of the Brown Act. The heart of the Brown Act is in the first few paragraphs, which basically says that the people do not yield their sovereignty to the legislative bodies they put in place, that the legislative bodies serve as instruments for the public and treats the public as just as much a part of the deliberations of the body as the members of the body itself, elected members of the body. So what I'm going to basically state is that I would like to see a change in procedure or a correction of procedure in the future so that we have a large body of information that's going to be made available, especially if it's made available, and I believe it was, to the committee members prior to the meeting, so they had time to digest it. As soon as it's made available to the members of the body, it should be made available to members of the public so that they can, we have to stay on top of it because we have to watch it on the website, but guys that are interested can and will do that, and then they could come and not be uninformed at the meeting proper.
So we received the briefing from Mark on Friday. I think you relayed it directly to us, Ty, is that correct?
Correct.
And when was the public access to the material made available?
Well, the actual version we're going to be seeing today was provided both to you and the public at this meeting because there has been changes.
Okay. So has that been a practice in the past as well, where we have, the committee has an advance opportunity to look at the material before the public, or is this?
That's what we've been doing.
Okay.
Mel, can I get you to speak into your microphone when you're speaking? Thank you.
Sure. Are there any other public or committee comments? Seeing none, we'll go on to number 3, fraud risk discussion. I think, Ty, is that yours?
Yes, regarding the fraud risk, there is nothing to report.
I guess we'll go on to number 4, the rate study, the thing everybody's been waiting for. I assume Mark is online. He's behind me?
He is behind you, yes.
Awesome. Okay,
Wow.
I'll turn around. Over to you, Mark, or unless you have some introductory comments you want to make, Ty or Don,
No, I think we'll just turn it over to Mark.
right?
And hopefully Mark can hear us.
Can you hear us, Mark?
He's on mute. We're on mute, one of us.
Can we remote unmute him, or can we get his attention?
I guess, I don't know if that's us.
Electric shock? It doesn't have to be a big one, just. Not sure what he's seeing of us. Is he seeing you? What does he see?
He sees what we're seeing.
He's probably still waiting for us to start, because he can't hear us. But I'm texting him.
Try now, please.
Mark?
Mark, can you hear us?
Hello? Yes, I can.
Okay, we gave you an introduction, and we'll do it again, but we're anxiously awaiting your comments on the rate
Okay.
study.
Sorry, I missed the introduction, huh? Jason, you went on mute again. There you go. Are you there, Jason?
Unmute it.
Now I can hear something.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you, Jason. The boardroom still appears to be muted.
Yeah, we're just going through my computer.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, well, over to you, Mark.
And, great. And do you have a screen up where I can share my screen, or is this just a conference call?
You should be able to share it on your side.
Oh, great. Okay. I will go ahead and start doing that. And let me know if you can see that.
We can.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for having me this afternoon. I'm going to go through some of the preliminary findings from the rate design study that we've been engaged in over the last few months. And I'll just go ahead and dive right into it. In terms of the agenda, I was going to just remind the group of the scope of work that I'm engaged in and what we're trying to achieve. Very briefly touch on the financial plan findings. I know that was a study that we completed back in the summer. The numbers have changed just a little bit because we've updated the capital spending, but I just wanted to show where those numbers stand. And then I'll very quickly jump into the cost of service results and some of the rate design options that we have ahead of us, and then we'll wrap up with the schedule. So let's see. So in terms of the objectives, you know, we're sort of in a phase 1, phase 2 status. The financial plan has been completed. So that first bullet really talks about the figuring out what type of rate increases are going to be needed in order to pay for the capital program and to make sure that you meet all of your revenue requirements and reserve targets. And then currently we're more focused on the cost of service analysis, which really kind of re-examines the district's existing rate structure to see if we can address some of the board's concerns by making some modifications to that structure and looking at various structures to do that. Just as a reminder, I think everybody in the room is aware, but Proposition 218 is the legal requirements that we need to meet. Everything that I propose and that is recommended will be compliant to the best of my knowledge with Proposition 218. It is a moving target, so there's case law that's evolving all the time, and I do my best to not just comply with existing case law, but also to anticipate what we see coming in terms of case law and the trajectory that the law has been going over the last 15 years. So the financial plan, so here's the updated capital spending. You can see that over the last 4 years, your average capital spending has been about 2.3, and the forecasted capital spending based on the CIP is looking to more than double, up to 5.3 million per year. We are looking at debt financing a certain amount, so you can see the amount of debt that's being proposed at the bottom of this graph. Let me get a pointer out. So down here, the 5 million, 2.7 would be the debt that is being proposed in this particular scenario. That would require 8% rate increases and 6% rate increases over the next 5 years. Anything beyond that is really so far out that it's really just a projection and not really worth hanging your hat on, but it's just based on what we know now, this is sort of the types of rate increases that we'd expect in years 6 through 10. The debt that you would incur would cost about $6.5 million in interest expense. So that's an expense that you wouldn't have if you didn't issue the debt. And the cumulative rate increase over the course of this whole, I guess this is 11 years, would be 79%. So that just kind of gives you a sense of the scale that we're talking about over the longer period. But really what we're looking at is making sure that your debt coverage ratio stays healthy, which it does here. In next year, you're forecasted to drop down to about 1.44, which is fine. You don't want to go below 1.25. That's your covenants require you to stay above 1.25. So it's in red just to show that you're getting in that direction, but you quickly turn it around. And so the debt coverage is fine over that course of that period with these rate increases. And your reserves stay well above the minimum reserves, which is the dashed line here. And we try to keep it towards your reserve targets, which is the black line.
Mark, what happened to the $9.4 million the board agreed to bond for? And what projects are we not doing as a result of not borrowing $9.4 million?
I'll have to defer to Ty on the district's plans with the 9.4 million.
Yeah, I don't have the projects in front of me, but this was covering the ones that we discussed in the board meeting that we were gonna debt finance. So we didn't cut any out. When we originally went in, it was with more than that amount, but this covers the projects, those big projects. There's 3 of them that we said we're gonna finance in the next 5 years.
I thought there were 4.
One of them the board decided to wait on. Which one was it?
Well, there were 3 or 4 of them we decided to wait on, but
Right.
I thought there were 4. I mean, I'm not gonna look at it right now, but all my notes go back and indicate that there were 4 items, and it was $9.4 million. So it's an internal issue. Obviously, Mark's not associated with that, but since the board agreed to doing, as I recall, 4 projects at $9.4 million, we need to get agreement on that somewhere.
Is there any argument about 9.4 million? Or is it the argument about the number of projects?
I think it's both, because we have the 7.7
Right.
within the rate study right now.
Yeah.
Well,
I can show you what the rate study assumes, that we are going to debt finance the Ridgecrest Heights booster for $1.5 million in 2024. And it assumes we're going to debt finance the 24-inch Springer line for $3.4 million in the same year. And then also debt finance the 24-inch Gateway Boulevard project for $2.5 million in 2025. So I'm not sure. Maybe the other big ticket here is this $2.5 million Gateway booster. But that's, already, it looks like the design might have already started on that project, or may already be completed. So maybe this is just jumped up too soon in the pipeline.
That one's the current one we're doing using leftover proceeds from the 2018 COP, so that would not be included.
I remember
There
there
you
were
go.
more projects. We decided that there was no way we're gonna get it done the next 5 years anyway, so we weren't gonna bond for it. now.
I think one of the 9.4 things is the Ridgecrest Heights booster was originally 2.5 million. And when we discussed it with Krieger and Stewart, it was knocked down to 1.5 million. So that's part of it.
Well, what I have in my notes is this sheet of paper that I'm sure you're familiar with, is the B-Zone 24-inch Springer Avenue transmission pipeline for $3.4 million.
He has that.
Okay.
The B-Zone 24-inch Gateway Boulevard transmission pipeline for $2.5 million.
He has that.
Yep.
The Ridgecrest Heights Booster replacement for $2.5 million.
That got lowered down to 1.5.
Pardon?
That got lowered down to 1.5 after talking with Krieger and Stewart.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, if we need less money, then that's great. I just want to make sure that
understand.
after we agreed to 9.4, that we somehow aren't skipping something.
And I think the fourth project was the Bowman PRV, which I thought the board agreed with to do cash capital.
Okay, so it's the Ridgecrest Heights booster replacement that is being delayed? Is that correct?
It's lower price.
It was 2.5, there were two $2.5 million things, making 5 million.
Correct.
A 3.4 million transmission line and a $1 million 0.1 million gallon D-zone reservoir for 1 million.
That's being pushed out. The D-zone reservoir is
Okay,
being
well, if
pushed
the
out.
1 million one was pushed out, that would bring it down to 8.4 million.
Right, and I'll take another million off because the Ridgecrest Heights booster isn't 2.5, it's only 1.5 million.
Oh. Okay. Well, borrowing less money is fine with me as long as we get the work done that we need to get done.
I understand.
Okay,
Great.
that's
Excellent.
fabulous.
Thank you for the question. Okay, so that's the financial forecast, and as I promised, I cover it pretty quickly because I know the focus here is really on the rate design. I think we'll have a lot to talk about. So jumping over the cost, service, and rate design. So again, just to cover the goals that we have when setting the design is first and foremost, we have to comply with legal requirements, which generally it's enough to go with accepted industry practice, but sometimes there's stuff that's specific to California that we need to comply with. That goes hand in hand with the second bullet, which is to fair and equitably recover the cost of providing service. That's the really what Proposition 218 is trying to achieve. So generally, when you achieve one, you achieve the other. And the third bullet is to develop a rate structure that provides fiscal stability. So that's one of the if we have options, we try to pick something that allows the district to have a reliable source of revenue, and also to improve affordability to the extent possible. So there's limits to what we can do with affordability, since Proposition 218 requires that the rates be proportionate to the cost of providing service. But to the extent that we can promote affordability, we certainly try to. So as a reminder, your current rate design is made up of fixed charges and commodity charges. The fixed charges is generally you refer to your ready to serve charge, the RTS, and the arsenic compliance charge. If you look at the last rate study, that ready to serve charge is actually made up of two components. There's an account charge within there, and then a meter charge, and together they make the ready to serve charge. So the account charge is a fixed portion that's based on that's assigned on a per account basis, and the ready to serve portion is based on the size of the meter, and they're combined, and we call it the ready to serve charge. Then there's also the arsenic compliance charge, which is also based on the meter size. And right now, the current fixed revenue is about 62% of your rate revenue. Now, it's important when I say rate revenue, I'm talking about just the revenue that you get from your rate. So if you that does not include your GSA revenue, which isn't rate revenue. That's a pass through of cost for the GSP and all the associated costs and your miscellaneous revenue, whatnot. So and because that's such a big number, it does matter. So when I say 62%, it's really between the fixed charges and the commodity charges that we're looking at here. The fixed charges recover 62%. So the remaining 38% or so gets recovered through your commodity charges, which are based on tiers. And your 4 tiers right now, based on the last rate study that I conducted while with Stantec, the 4 tiers are justified based on peaking costs and the cost of your conservation program. And so we're really looking at the amount of water customers are using during peak months, and then making assumptions about peak day usage, and then also assigning conservation costs to the highest tiers to create those tiers. And then the water allocation, so how much water folks get within the 4 tiers, is based on water needs. So we looked at indoor water needs, outdoor water needs, etc., and scaled those based on meter size. Outside of the quote unquote rates, as I mentioned, are your GSA fees, which is a uniform rate. So in other words, every gallon is charged the same amount, regardless of, it's not a tiered rate. So we call that a uniform rate, and that's for all water usage. And it's based on the amount of revenue that you need to recover in order to pay for the GSA replenishment fee and the GSP expense.
Mark, on the last rate study, and I think you just mentioned it here, there were some ratios associated with the base costs and the peak value costs and all that kind of thing. And it was all based upon some numbers coming out of a 1995 rate general plan, I guess it was. Our pumping has changed dramatically in the last 5 years, let alone the last 15 years or 20 years. Have we modified what we did in the last rate study at all regarding the calculation of all those peak values and day values and hour values and that type of thing?
I did look at the change in water patterns, because I think you are right that some of the assumptions that we use to inform the rates for your current rate structure were in part based on some previous planning documents. But we primarily were looking at the actual, average use across the entire year versus the average use during peak month. And then we made some assumptions about what peak day usage looked like, since we obviously don't we don't have real-time metering. So we only have data on a monthly basis. So there's no way to know what peak day looks like for different customer classes. And that's where we use some assumptions about what that peaking would look like. But to answer your question, yes, the peak month numbers have changed dramatically. And the amount of usage in the 4 different tiers has changed dramatically over the last 5 years. And as a result, if we were to use exactly the same assumptions and the same methodology as we did 4 years ago during the last rate study, we would come up with very different rates. The 4 different tiers would look very different because of those change in water usage. And so you'll see that in the numbers as I finish my presentation.
Okay, I was just making sure that you have looked at it and it's somehow been incorporated.
Yeah, I'm aware.
I don't need the details. I just want to make sure that we
Sure.
haven't ignored the water use patterns.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They're the very foundation of the analysis, that water use pattern. And to be honest, what happened 4 years ago is sort of irrelevant. I'm working with what has happened more recently, because that's what the rates should be based on. So we really are looking at the new normal when we talk about what these rates should look like.
Okay, great.
So what we're proposing to change about the rate design is that, as I mentioned, we'll update the cost of service analysis. And this goes right to your point. in that there's been some notable changes in 2018. One, there's been a decrease in general in water usage due to conservation. I'm sorry. There's been a decrease in the conservation program spending. So this is important because the current rates that you charge for Tier 4, the only reason that your Tier 4 rates are different from your Tier 3 rates is because of the conservation program. The methodology that we use is we said we're going to recover peak day usage, the cost of peak day from folks in Tier 3. And we're also going to recover peak day from folks in Tier 4. The price difference is that the folks in Tier 4 were also going to pay for the cost of the conservation program. And back in 2018, that conservation program, and I apologize, I haven't looked at these numbers in a few weeks, but I believe it was on the order of like $300,000 or more for your conservation program on an annual basis back then. And because of the GSA costs and all the efforts that have been made there, the conservation program budget has been reduced dramatically to below $100,000 and maybe even below $50,000. And so that entire justification for the Tier 4 rates has kind of gone away. So that's one of the realities we're faced with is, how do we justify tier? If we're going to keep 4 tiers, we need to come up with a different reason for justifying Tier 4 because the conservation program cost has really gone down. And then to your point, there's been a very large decrease in water usage since 2018, and that, predictably enough has happened particularly in Tier 3 and Tier 4 usage. So what we're going to do today is we're going to evaluate we're going to look at Tier 4 tiers and look at how we can try to recreate what you currently have, but we also wanted to take a look at a 2-tier structure. And I think there's a lot of benefits to this 2-tier structure, namely because I mentioned earlier that we try to stay ahead of where Prop 218 is going, and I read different court cases and I'm involved in helping to protect clients that are being sued. And one of the things that the court has been getting is becoming more and more incredulous about is this idea that you can charge tiered rates based on peaking. And part of that is because we don't have smart meters, right? And so you're charging folks for a peak day based on assumptions of what their usage is during a peak day, but you don't actually have any real data that says that's what they use during a peak day. And so you make assumptions about what their behavior is relative to the peak month, and you assign costs. But without hard and fast data, the courts are becoming a little bit more skeptical of whether or not that can be justified. So in general, I try to find, when possible, other ways of devising tiered rates that does not rely on peaking. If you were to follow this 2-tier structure, what we would do is that we would essentially just charge a uniform rate for all of your district operating capital costs. So basically everything that's not GSA, except for the GSA pumping, we would include that. But we would recover all of your commodity charges through a uniform rate, charge the same rate to everyone for all water usage. Tier 2 would be, a higher rate, a surcharge, and that would recover all of your GSA replenishment costs. And what's interesting about this is that by complete happenstance, well, I won't get into that right away, but the Tier 1 rate would be the amount of water that we'd sell at the Tier 1 rate would be the volume of water that is currently allowed by the GSA. So you have a pumping limit above which you're charged for the GSA costs. The proposal would be that everybody gets to pay Tier 1 rates as long as they're below the threshold of what triggers the GSA replenishment costs, and then above that they'd be responsible for paying for this Tier 2 surcharge that would help recover those GSA replenishment costs. And so there's a very, very clear cost nexus there. I mean, really as clear as it gets, and highly defensible in court. where you would simply say, we're justifying our tier 2 rate on this very real basis that it costs the district more when folks use so much water that we're forced to pay for this GSA replenishment costs. So we'll get into the details of what that looks like. I have more graphics that help explain how that works, but that's the concept. And then the other concept that was requested by this subcommittee last month was to look at scenarios where we lower the fixed revenue and try to recover more through the commodity rates. So we'll show you what those rates would look like.
Mark, on
Yes.
two things. Going back to the top bullet, talking about the conservation program, in my mind, when I look back at it, the money that we put into tier 4 could have just as easily, because tiers 2 and 3 are discretionary type water usage. We could have put those conservation spending into either tier 2 or tier 3, or a combination of tier 2 and tier 3, and avoided that bulge in our fee curve the way we did it. There's very little money, pardon me, there's quite a bit of money, but very few units of water, and that really makes the fee structure look funny. But I wholeheartedly agree that if we can get rid of tier 4, because the conservation dollars are so little, as far as I'm concerned, we're getting no return on our money from conservation at this point in time. Conservation is coming down because the water rates are going up, and that has been a very effective mechanism for conservation. So I would encourage you to keep looking at the conservation area and either eliminate it altogether or get it down to the point where we could throw it into either tier 2 or tier 3.
Sure.
And the comment with regard to the 2-tier structure, when I look at it, my feeling is that the reason we have tiers is to try to give a break to our health and safety area of those first 9 units. And we're hoping, and of course, that was one of the things that the board said, is let's see if we can't reduce the fees to tier 1. And that's the original definition of tier 1 through 9. When we combine the current tier 1, which is 1 through 9, with tier 2, and take tier 1 up to 24, we're losing our control over being able to do anything for our health and safety water users, and that concerns me. So
Okay.
I'm not against 2 tiers, but it seems to me we had the option of either combining tier 2, the current tier 2, with the current tier 3 and 4 to make a bigger tier, because it's all discretionary water. And as far as the GSA fees go, we could actually start charging the GSA fees at any unit number. It doesn't actually have to line up with a designated tier, as far as I could see. So I do not like the idea of not allowing us to try to give a break to the tier 1 users.
Okay, we need to be careful when we talk about, trying to give a break to customers, because that's exactly what Proposition 218 prohibits, is trying to
Right.
shape your rates in order to achieve an objective that's anything other than just recovering costs.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, but I think based upon the last rate study, where you have your basic charge, going to everybody, including tier one, and then you incrementally add functionality as well as cost to 2, 3, and 4. I like the way you did that, and that seems to me to be a perfectly logical and legal way of doing that.
Yeah, I agree that to this date, it remains legal. There's no court case law that prohibits it. But there are some concerns that the future might hold that. But I appreciate your input, and we'll dive a little bit more into all these options, and we'll look at exactly what the fiscal impact are of the different alternatives, so you can see exactly how much it's going to affect the different types of customers. So just to look at this conceptually, the idea of 4 tiers versus 2 tiers, and now, and I believe this is it's Stan, right? Who's speaking? I just want to make sure I'm clear on that.
Yes.
Okay, great. So Stan's point about the 3 tiers is an interesting one, because now that the conservation program is really been reduced to very little, that could be a logical option, would be to basically keep your existing justification, but just eliminate tier 4 and just have a 3-tier structure, which acknowledges the fact that you really don't spend much on your conservation program anymore. And so we really would justify tier 1 based on average day, tier 2 based on average day, peak month, and tier 3 based on peak day, just as you currently do. And as I mentioned earlier, the tier thresholds that were established previously and which are still applicable, I believe, may need to be updated a bit, but I think that the logic is still pretty good. Would be that the tier 1 is for indoor water needs, tier 2 is for efficient outdoor water needs, tier 3 is for extra outdoor water needs, and tier 4 is basically excessive use. Again, it's really important to understand that this has always been a sort of an industry standard approach to rate setting, where you establish tier thresholds based on water needs. But again, looking at the future and trying to look at which way the courts are going, the reality is that the district's costs are completely ambivalent and are not affected at all by people's water needs. They're not, the district isn't affected by health and safety water needs or indoor water needs or outdoor water needs. None of that affects the district's operating costs. And so while it makes a lot of sense for us and for customers to talk about, hey, let's give water based on these different thresholds, because this is what makes sense to our customers. At the end of the day, it really doesn't affect the district's reality and the cost that the district has of providing service. And so we just need to be careful. I'm fine with continuing with that logic, but I just want to be perfectly clear that I see the future steering away from basing thresholds on people's needs and really going towards the reality of the district's water supply and what are the limits that cause the district to spend more money. And that's what you see on the right side, the 2 tiers, is that magically enough, which is totally coincidence, if you take tier 1 and tier 2 and you add them together and you gave everyone a budget of a tier threshold of 24 HCF for the smallest water, and you scale that up based on meter size, but that's basically exactly your tier 1 and tier 2 threshold right now. If you add all that up, that adds up to exactly the district's current GSA water allocation. Total coincidence, but it works out really well. So you would basically be selling, everyone would get their tier 1, tier 2, what's currently known as tier 1, tier 2 for tier 1 rates in the 2-tier structure, and anything above, anything in tier 3 and beyond would be assigned the tier 2 rate, which would pay for the district's GSA costs, because that's the level of use that triggers the GSA costs. Does that make sense?
Mark, oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
were you done? I've got a couple questions or comments. One of the things we had talked about doing is make sure that we understand what the new state, how the new state laws impact our tier structure, identifying the width of tiers. We used a lot size of 17,000 square feet for the average lot. And that built the numbers up for outdoor use of, I think, 15 units for efficient use, and then 21 or something like that for inefficient use, or whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
The new state laws are not going to allow us to give that much water to anybody. I was hoping that we could somehow pull our tier structure down to be more compatible with what the state's going to require us to get to. My feeling is that if we use something like 24 units, that's basically 208 gallons per person per day for the I don't remember if it was the combination of indoor and outdoor or just outdoor. But I don't think the state's, based upon their indoor estimate for 55 gallons per person per day, not that I think we can meet that. I think our tier structure should not be such that we encourage people to use more water than that. Although I think our tier 1 at 9 units is probably reasonably close if we throw in 1 or 2 units for the swamp cooler. But in my estimation, the numbers that we've got for tier 3 and, for tier 2 and 3, being 15 and 21, the state would look at that and just, of course, nobody knows what the state's going to do because the laws are not even well defined yet. But my feeling is we got to do something about getting them more compatible with where we think the state might be going. And I think tier 1 already is. I don't see either tier 2, which is basically saying you're going to use twice as much water for outdoors as you do indoors, even before you throw in tier 3, which is the extra outdoor water needs. So I think we need, and that was one of the things on the sheets that we were talking about earlier, estimate indoor plus outdoor allocations. And I don't see that we've actually done anything in that respect yet. So I'm fine with at least 3 tiers. The 4th tier, I'm never sure I ever agreed we really needed, but I do think that the tier widths need to be more compatible with what's going on today in the state of California and what they're going to force us to do. We don't want to look like we're encouraging people to use more water than legally allowed. And of course, the onus is on us, not the people. We can't,
Right.
it's our responsibility, and quite frankly, the only control we have is cost.
Right.
So,
Well, no, I'm glad you made that last point, because a lot of people don't understand that. They think that those state laws are going to trickle down to the individual level, and that somehow the state's going to impose these water budgets for individual accounts, when you obviously understand that that's not the case. That's just the way that the state will measure what the district's total budget is, so to speak. We can certainly look at updating the allocations to those different tiers. The state hasn't established anything yet, and so there's really no hard numbers that we can use right now. As you probably already know, we're using 70 gallons per capita per day, and we're assuming 3 people per household. Either of those numbers could be updated, but that's what gets us to the 9 HCF, and frankly, 70 is it's not 55, but it's certainly in the ballpark, and it's in the right direction. And because the state hasn't quote unquote dropped the hammer on that metric yet, it seems like it would be appropriate to stay in that ballpark. And you also mentioned the swamp coolers and the fact that people's indoor water needs might be different for your service area. It might not be the typical 55 gallons per day that they dictate for the rest of the state.
Well, and since it's our responsibility to meet and satisfy the ordinance, not the people's, if we want to give an extra unit or two for swamp coolers, as long as we feel we can meet the other requirements, it seems to me we ought to have that latitude. So I have no problem with tier one. But I put together some analysis and gave to Ty. I don't know if he gave it to you or not, but the actual lot size for all of the homes in Ridgecrest that were for sale in the last 2 years was a tad over 8,000 square feet or that thereabouts, I believe.
Yeah.
Not anywhere near the 17,000 that we're currently using.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because we talk about indoor water use and outdoor water use. Ultimately, all we care about is total water use, really. We don't really care if they use all of it indoors or all of it outdoors or a split between. Ultimately, we only care about how much total water they use. And, the argument has been made that having a two-tier structure is actually provides a stronger signal than 4 tiers, because 4 tiers, you sort of gradually get from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And so the steps are less painful, so to speak, less noticeable to customers. Whereas if it's one really big step from 1 to 2, people really pay attention to that. And they say, I don't want to go on to tier 2. I want to stay in tier 1 because it jumps from $2 up to $6 or whatever it's going to be. And so it just becomes a stronger signal and a more effective way of communicating that limit with customers. And, as long as that total of 24 HCF is the right number, in terms of what you anticipate the state requirements to be, which I think it will be. I think 24 is certainly within the right ballpark of what the state would probably dictate. That might be a more effective way of communicating that conservation need to your customers.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and it's been very difficult to get information from the state. But since the indoor usage is 55 and going down, it's hard for me to believe, and that's roughly 7 tiers, plus you add a couple for the swamp coolers. But the 15 is twice, the outdoor being twice the indoor. I guess that may not go real well with the state. I don't know. And again, I don't have a crystal ball any more than you do. However, when you throw in an additional, that is, if you just only had 3 tiers, you wouldn't have to worry about the 21 because it goes away. It's what's left.
Right.
And,
Yeah,
and so,
agreed.
so two tiers there, or pardon me, 3 tiers, with the third one being unlimited or not controlled, in my mind, does make a whole lot more sense.
Yeah.
And we could still recover the GSA fees in that tier 3 and not spread it across tier 1 and tier 2, is that correct?
Oh, right. Yeah, we can, as far as I'm concerned, as long as 2 and 3 are discretionary by definition, because health and safety ends at 9, we can apply those fees however we want to break them up between 2 and 3.
Yeah. I mean, you have to have, can't be totally arbitrary. You got to have a logic, and we have to be able to explain it. It's still falls under 218, and so we can't.
Right.
But I do agree there is a certain amount of latitude.
There is, by the way, at one point in time, we were getting 67% of our water allocation, And at this point in time, you're saying that we're getting 78% of our water allocation. Obviously, that changes as we use less water. And so to that extent, I'd actually prefer not to tie any of our tiers to what the water allocation is. And in fact, I would personally like to see it go away. And I don't think tied any of our tiers to the GSA from a political standpoint makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I don't, from a political standpoint, I can't speak to that, but I can tell you that from a defensibility standpoint, it makes a lot of sense, because it's a very clear nexus between why you're charging the GSA fee at a certain level of water usage. It's very clearly the threshold at which folks are creating that cost for the district. In other words, if everyone's just used tier 1 water, if everyone used 24 HCF or less, you would not have any GSA costs, at least the replenishment costs.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it is discretionary. And the only thing
Discretionary?
that isn't discretionary is tier 1, and that's health and safety. And I feel very strongly we need to protect that. And then we got to decide how do we distribute the GSA fees.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the comment about it being discretionary. Could you explain?
The health and safety is what we consider what is absolutely needed for the health and safety of our people. So we don't, even though I guess you could say, well, maybe they could take an 8-minute shower rather than a 9-minute shower or something like that. But if that is the indoor use, which is what the state is pushing, all of the outdoor use is what the people decide they want to use. They can use none, or they can use, right now, there's no limit. If they can afford it, they can use it. So to that extent, it's discretionary, and it won't impact health or safety.
Okay. Well, let me continue with the slides, and I think we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk through these. But I just want to explain conceptually what we're looking at here, and then we can continue. So discuss the tier thresholds. So again, the concept of, and so we talk about tier width and tier height, right? So this is the tier threshold is the width. So how much water do you get in each tier, and that's explained here. Tier 4, it's based on water needs, which I've explained. There's some weaknesses there in terms of legal defensibility. And tier 2 is based on the district's water supply realities, which I think is much more defensible, but either can be made to work. When we talk about tier height, that's the rate that you're charging per tier. And so that's, demonstrated here that in the 4-tier system that you currently have, this is your current methodology for your current rates. The tier 1 rate, the base of the tier 1 rate, just the tier 1 rate, just the gray area here, is based on your base capacity cost. So that's basically average day costs is reflected in tier 1. Tier 2 is peak day capacity costs. Tier 3 is peak hour capacity costs. And then tier 4 is peak hour plus conservation. So this last portion up here was to pay for what used to be a pretty expensive conservation program, but that no longer exists. And so we would, might want to talk about just doing the 3 tiers and doing away with 4 tiers. On top of that, you have a uniform rate of your GSA costs, which when you add the replenishment with the GSP costs, comes out to $1.89 per HCF. And that's a uniform rate that's added to the top of each one of these. So you can see that the current rates down here, when you combine the tiered plus the GSA, is 271 all the way up to 743. And when I run the new numbers, which again uses the same $1.89, because these GSA costs have not changed, or aren't you're budgeted to stay at about the same level. The new cost of service results actually show a slight decrease in tier 1 to 266. Tier 2 increases just a little bit. Tier 3 increases quite a bit, and I'll explain that in a second. And tier 4 actually decreases quite a bit. So the reason tier 3 increases is because the costs have remained pretty much the same, but the amount of water that you're currently selling in tier 3 has gone down. So when we come up with these rates here, you have a numerator, which is the cost, and you have a denominator, which is the amount of water you sell in that tier. And so when the amount of water that you sell gets smaller, the number gets bigger. And right now you use a lot less water than you used to back in 2018. And so as a result, the unit cost has jumped up measurably to, probably about 70 cents or so. Tier 4, the reason it's dropped so much is because, as I mentioned before, those conservation costs, which were a big part of justifying tier 4, have all but gone away. And so we're seeing a big drop in that tier 4. In fact, tier 3 and tier 4 are essentially the same. No one in tier 3 is gonna notice that they went to tier 4 when the rates look like this, and they're only 60 cents difference. Looking at the 2-tier commodity rates, we'd have uniform rates for all the district costs. So all of your operating costs and all your capital costs and all your debt service would all be recovered, or at least the portion that you're getting through commodity rates would all be recovered at the same rate at $2.06. Sorry, not quite $2.06, because 24 cents of that would be for the GSA pumping costs, and that by agreement, I believe, has to remain a uniform cost for all water usage. So there's the pumping cost portion and the district cost portion, which are added together to give you $2.06. And then the GSA replenishment cost would only be recovered from tier 2 usage, and so it would jump to $8.70. So this is a really big jump, obviously, and a very noticeable jump. And so this is what I was talking about earlier, that this may be a more effective way of communicating conservation and sending a price signal to your customers, because they will notice when they go from tier 1 and tier 2. And so if this 24 HCF is a reasonable number for what you think the state's going to impose, and I agree, you might want to take a closer look at what we think that number might be, but the reality is that number doesn't exist yet, so it would just be conjecture. But and we could always change this number to be something closer to what we think or when the state does come up with a number, you could change it to be that number. But you would essentially get a much more effective pricing signal from this type of a structure, and it would be more legally defensible in my mind. The numbers I have down here are just for comparison. This is the current tier 1 rate, and this is the current tier 4 rate with the GSA fee, just to show you that even it would actually, the proposed tier 2 would be higher than your current tier 4. Okay. So that's the concept between tier 4 and tier 2. Now, I received a request last time that we look at recovering less through our fixed costs. So this is a mirror image of the methodology that was used back in 2008 of allocating costs to either the ready to serve charge versus the commodity. And so we have costs that are allocated on a percent basis, either to the account charge. So again, this is the fixed charge that we recover on an account basis, or the meter charge, which is the fixed charge that we recover based on the meter size. And then we have the commodity charge, which is basically recovered through your commodity rates and turned into tiered rates. And then the arsenic charge, which is that uniform rate that we recover for, or sorry, that's a fixed charge that we recover through meter, size of the meter. Arsenic's pretty straightforward, where we just recover 100% of the arsenic cost through that one, so we can eliminate that one. And then we basically assign percentages to these different categories based on how you want to recover these costs. Do we want to recover it through the account charge or the meter charge or the commodity charge? So this gets us to 61% fixed revenue, which is very close to what you currently recover through your fixed revenue. If we wanted to flip that, the scenario we looked at, well, what if we want to only have 40% fixed revenue? Well, you can see how that would play out here. We would just recover 50% of your customer service and meter charge costs through the account charge. And we recover about 55 or 5% of your debt and capital through the account charge, and about half of your debt and capital through the meter charge. And that gets us to 40% fixed. Now, I'm not a big fan of this particular approach, but we were asked to look at these numbers. So that's how we would get there. So you have all of these essentially fixed costs, your supply and transmission, which is really fixed in by nature, your field services, which are fixed. You have all these fixed costs that you're going to try to recover through your commodity rate. So you're going to become much more vulnerable to changes in water usage. Financially, you'll have a lot less stability in your revenue because you're trying to recover a bunch of fixed costs through your commodity rates.
Hey, Mark, you wanna go to the slide before and go over the note at the bottom?
Oh, sorry, thank you. Right, so it is worth noting that your costs, your variable costs, if we look at your actual variable costs, and so when we say variable costs, are costs that actually go up or go down based on the amount of water that you sell. Your actual variable costs are only 22%. So if you were to actually set up your rates to be a mirror image of your costs, you would actually have 80% fixed, or it'd be 78% fixed, and your commodity rates would only recover 22% of your rates. So already with the 61%, you're already recovering some of your fixed revenue through your commodity. And furthermore, if you take out your GSA replenishment fee, because your replenishment fee is a perfect example of a cost that goes up with increased water usage and goes down with decreased water usage. If you take that fee out, your variable costs are only 3.6%. It's a very, very small amount. It's basically saying that most of your costs are fixed, and so the more you can recover through your fixed revenue, the better for the district from a fiscal stability standpoint.
The numbers that you've given in this latest brief are just slightly different than what I received 2 or 3 days ago. Originally, it was 41.1 and 62.6. Are those the only numbers that are off, or are the numbers in the table also off? That is, I didn't notice a change in the actual fixed cost, that is the 45.02 and the 29.50, or in the last set of documents I got. And so.
Well,
I'm
yeah, and I did mean to mention that. Yeah, I did update some of these numbers, and we'll make this latest version of the presentation available to you. So I do apologize for any slight changes. It is a work in progress at this point. So
right.
numbers are pretty close, but they are a little bit different.
Okay, but the 61.4 and the 40.3 are the correct numbers.
Correct.
And
yeah,
all of the fixed
61.4.
monthly charges, that table always was correct. You just
That's
cheat, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. These numbers all stayed the same. Well, I mean, the percentages changed a little bit, but the the actual dollar numbers in the table should be the same. So this might not speak a lot to you. I mean, there's a lot of numbers that show the, you know, the existing rates on the left side and the proposed rates on the right side. And really this table and this table are the same since they're the existing rates, and it's just trying to compare the difference between existing rates versus the proposed rates. And so you can see that if you kept the 61% fixed more or less, you can see that some of the the impact of the different meter sizes is a little bit different because of the change in the cost of service results. In the case of the 40% fixed, there would be a universal decrease in the fixed bill, commensurate with the, you know, about a 33% decrease in fixed revenue. Pretty predictable. But I think the most useful way, and I could take you through all the different rate schedules and whatnot, and I think it'd be a lot of numbers that would be hard to shift through. I think that at the end of the day, the easiest way to explain the impact of these different scenarios is to just do these bill impacts. And so this is showing at the end of the day, how are different customers going to be affected by these different scenarios. And so this first one is if we kept the 4 tiers and we kept 62% fixed revenue, so essentially kept exactly the same methodology that we had from 2018 and just recalibrated it based on the new cost of service analysis, based on the reality of your new water usage behavior and the new operating costs and new capital costs. What would the rate increases look like? And we are talking about a general 8% increase to customers. Well, the rate revenue, keep in mind that if we go back to the financial plan here, the rate revenue increase is 8% for year 1. So that's the amount of rate revenue that will increase in that particular year. The reason that all of these percentages back here are less than 8% is because recall that the GSA charge is going down. We didn't discuss that explicitly, but the amount that is being charged for the GSA replenishment charge, based on the, I guess I apologize. I meant to put in a slide in here that talked about this directly, but the pumping projections or the pumping from last year resulted in a certain amount for the GSA replenishment charge, and the most recent projections that I got from Ty was that your GSA replenishment costs are going to be lower this year because the pumping is lower, and so those costs go down. And so that's why this overall change to people's bills isn't the full 8% increase, because they're going to be seeing the savings through the GSA costs are going down. But what is important to know here is just the relative impact to different types of customers. So you have your low single family water users who would see a 4% increase. Median water users for single family would see a 2.5% increase. Average would be about the same. And then high water users would see an increase of 8%. And you can kind of go through and if there's a particular type of customer or a profile that's missing from this table that you'd like to see in future presentations, please let me know. I'd be happy to add it.
Your high water use is 45, which is the top of the tier 3.
That's right.
And we do have some tier 4 users. So it would be, I mean, that should show a significant decrease, I would think.
Right. Yeah. So this is basically the customer that will see the highest percent increase to their bill will be the people who are using the most amount of tier 3 without using any tier 4. You're exactly right.
Right. And we have one
And-
director that is consistently in a tier 4. I'm sure he will want to see at least something in tier 4.
Okay, so you want me to do an extra high user?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. You know,
Okay.
in a 75 or 80 category, I don't care. I mean, it doesn't, just so it's enough to demonstrate that it goes down.
Sure. Okay. Happy to do that. So then if we look at the next table, this will be the same idea, but this is the two-tier system with the 62% fixed. And I apologize, it should be 61%, that's a typo. So the 62%, 61% with two tiers would see only a 1.8% increase for low water users, a decrease of 7% and for median and 12% for average. And then you see these high water users really get kicked on the nose as you correctly start assigning those GSA fees to the customers who are creating the GSA costs.
A clarification on the low and medium average use. I
Mhm.
could track that with a 4-tier system. What are those numbers for 2-tier?
So these would all these, so the two tier is, the threshold is 21. So
Okay.
anyone below 21, the HCF would
Okay,
stay in
okay,
tier
thank
1.
you.
24.
Or 24.
Sorry, 24, thank you, 24.
Okay. I
Um,
could have answered that myself.
For the master meters, this is really just taking average use across the different types of customers. So I, looked at all your duplexes and looked at what was the average use across all your duplexes, and that's how I came up with these water usages and clearly average use across all these master meters and commercial type customers are all staying within their tier 1 or existing within tier 1, tier 2 water usage, and that's why you're seeing all these decreases. So really the increases are going to come from a select few customers, and those customers are going to see a pretty big increase in their bills. So I think it is reasonable to assume that you'll experience a dramatic reaction. Your customers that are using a lot of water and suddenly are paying this new tier 2 rate, the $8, will probably cut back their water usage even more. And the beauty of the system is that the decrease in the revenue that you get will be commensurate with the decrease in costs that you'll experience, because the less water they use, they'll be proportionate to the decrease in your cost of paying for the GSA replenishment. And so it's not going to hurt the district when they reduce their water usage. That's the beauty of this two-tier structure.
But it would make the 40% fixed cost discussion more risky.
It would, but you'll be recovering yes, but all of those costs will be recovered through the tier 1 rates, which is a much more stable source of revenue. Folks who are, below 20, you're right that you are putting more revenue at risk, but at least it's at risk for usage below 24 HCF and not for usage above that, which it tends to be more volatile. Speaking of which, here is that scenario. So here's two tiers with the 41% fixed. And so here you can see low water users would see a pretty massive decrease in their bill. Median and average would see pretty similar as the previous scenario, 14 and 12% decreases, and then the high water user sees an even larger increase to their bill.
But
and you can see the impacts across the different types of customers, but,
'Cause
so you would be, that uniform rate in this particular case would be higher. Let me pull it up if I can tell you what it would be, because I mentioned it would be a total of 206 for the 2 tiers and 60%. And if you did 2 tiers and 40%, be just a moment. It'd be $3.10, that uniform rate. So it'd be $1 more for HCF because you're recovering more of your fixed costs through your commodity rates.
Okay. And just for clarification again, so high use in this case would be basically anybody that's currently getting Tier 3 and Tier 4 under the current rate structure?
This is that 45 represents folks who use all of their Tier 3 allotment and they have not yet entered into Tier 4 yet.
Okay.
So I could add, I'm going to, based on the request, I'm going to add an even higher water user that will be on the 75 to 80 scale, and you'll see they'll have a pretty dramatic increase to their bill as well.
Okay, thank you.
But Mark, it is true in the 2-tier setup, if there's reduction of use in the second tier, that still does have some impact on the operational revenue recovery, because it is a uniform rate, correct? Plus the GSA fee.
Yes, no, you are right that because within that Tier 2 rate, there's that uniform component and you'd be losing that revenue. So it wouldn't be exactly proportionate. You are right that there would be some losses there. Which is, further underlines the importance of keeping the higher, the 60%, the 61% is definitely my recommendation to the district, to keep that fixed revenue as high as possible, just to make sure, especially with this really big capital program coming up, you don't want to have any hiccups or surprises in your revenue stream as you start to make commitments to these large projects and you start issuing debt and whatnot. It would be a pretty big problem if sudden decrease in water usage threw a wrench in those plans.
I just heard something that I guess I didn't realize before. Going back to 14, where we first talked about the 2-tier commodity rates.
Yeah.
The bottom, which says district costs, are you saying that does not include in Tier 2 any peak day capacity costs or peak hour capacity costs? And that the only difference between the Tier 1 and Tier 2 rates is the GSA replenishment fee?
Right, so this entire area down here in the light gray represents all of the district's costs, aside from what you're recovering through the fixed portion. So this does include all your peak day, peak hour, conservation, everything is included in this uniform rate here. And so if you can imagine, if water usage went down, and I just drew a line here where this revenue became smaller, then most of the costs would be associated with this GSA replenishment cost, which would be going away. But there is a portion of that, as Ty just pointed out, which would be district costs that really mostly would not go away, because as we've talked about before, most of the only 3.5% of the district's costs are variable. So there would be a shortfall that would result from that.
So with the exception of again on page 14, with the exception that we have taken the fixed fee out of the, out of play, what is left is a flat or uniform fee across all of the commodity fee?
Yeah, it's a uniform rate across all water usage to recover district costs. And then the tiered portion would just be created by the GSA replenishment costs.
Okay, so in other words, all you do is take your total water, what we're calling it, water revenue, subtracting the fixed fee and dividing by the total water units?
Yes, you got it.
Okay. Okay, I'm, I'm glad Ty spoke up because that didn't come through the first time.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You take what we call it the revenue requirement, right? So we look at all of the district's costs, not looking at GSA, but just looking at the district's direct operating and capital costs. And then from that, we subtract everything you're going to get through the fixed charge. And what's left is how much you need to recover through your commodity rates.
Okay.
And so that amount is divided by your total water sales, and it gives you your uniform rate that would be represented right here. It'd be $2.06 basically. So I think that's it for my slides. I just did want to point out that I talked to staff about these different components. You got a zone charge, construction meters, and private fire and bulk water rates. Those are not going to see any structural changes. I reviewed the methodologies and they're still applicable and relevant. And so they would go up with whatever percent increases that you decided to apply with the rate increases, but the structure themselves wouldn't change. And then here's the schedule. So before I go there, I'm just going to keep it on this particular table because in case it's not clear, this is my own, as a rate consultant, when I look at the three options that we just talked about, this would be my preference because the higher fixed revenue appeals to me just because it provides the district with more stability. And it's a better reflection of your costs, the reality of your costs. You have very low variable costs, and so it makes sense to have as high a fixed revenue as possible. And then I like the two tiers for the two reasons. One is because it's more legally defensible, which is a high priority for me. I'm defending way too many clients who are being sued and sometimes sued successfully, not for my work, if I might add, but for work that they've done in the past. There's just way too many lawsuits out there, and you hate to see districts and cities lose money over these lawsuits. And so one is defensibility, and two is I truly do think that it sends a stronger signal than a 4-tier structure, simply because that jump from tier 1 to tier 2 is so big that it just jumps off the page, and I think it's a more effective communication tool. So with that, I'll open it up to questions, comments, discussion.
We have a public comment coming up, Mark.
Hi, Mark. My name's Mike Senat. There's a possibility that the allocations would actually change. Does that change if I understand what you're saying, is the allocation that the water district has right now roughly lines up with the allocation that was, I guess, given to the water district, not subject to
Right.
not subject to the GSA fee. So
the pumping allocation.
right. So
Yeah. So right now it's 4,390 acre feet per year.
Yep.
And that's a very good point. That's not a static number. That's a number that's subject to change. And I haven't we haven't detailed the final structure yet, but I think if I were asked, I would propose making that essentially a pass-through, where the district's, ordinance or their resolution would simply state that that tier two rate would change in a dynamic manner based on the costs coming from the GSA, and one of the variables there would be the allowance. And so if the allowance went up or down, that would have a direct and immediate impact to what the tier two rates would look like.
And the tier one width as well, would it not?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand all that exchange. My understanding is our allocation is like 4,380, real close to 4,400 acre feet per year. We do not anticipate that changing. What we would anticipate changing, at least in the very near future, is with the increased fees that water use will go down. So therefore, the fee we pay will go down until, new people coming in increase the water use again and one thing or another.
Well, I think that the nature of the question is, right now, you're right, you have an allowance, the 4390, and you also have a cost of 2,130 per acre foot. I think the point of the question, if I understand correctly, is if either of those change, for whatever reason, what would happen? And I think that my recommendation would be that the language, the districts would create what we would call a pass-through language, which would allow for those numbers to dynamically affect the rates, because it's very simple math on how that would affect the tier two rate. And so it would, and tie to your point, yes, the threshold would change, and the dollar per acre foot would change as well.
Just to be clear though, the 4390 won't stay the same. It's likely to change based on the Navy changing their pumping. And they've indicated
Right.
to the GA that they do intend to change that number over time.
Yeah, but I believe we've indicated back that it was a Prop 218 fee that was approved based upon a schedule of allocations. We have not volunteered to reduce our allocation. And at this point in time,
On whether you went down the 40% fixed or 60% fixed model. If you had the 40% fixed model, the impacts would be far greater to the district and more profound. And that's why I am recommending that you stay with 60%. I don't have the analysis at my fingertips because it would depend on how much water reduction we're talking about. But it would have an impact. And, you know, there's ways of mitigating that. The most resilient way of mitigating that is by setting rates that reflect actual fixed versus actual variable. But in your case, that would be 97% fixed, and so I don't think that would fly very well with customers. Another method, another tool that some districts use is what's called drought surcharge rates, which are provisions in the ordinance that allow the district to put in add surcharges to the rates in the event that, you know, higher than expected water reductions occur, and that would allow the district to be able to increase the commodity rates to be able to make sure that it can afford its debt and meet its bond covenants and whatnot until another rate study is conducted to look at new water use behaviors. So it is a real threat. You know, when people reduce their water usage, I think that in your case, folks have already reduced water quite a bit, and so I could be wrong, but I wouldn't anticipate that even if people did react to this and reduce their water usage more, I would like to think that it wouldn't be such a massive impact that it would affect your financial stability.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe Ty has a different opinion.
You just gave me the perfect lead in to my comment on this. You know, when I look at this, just for a variety of reasons, I prefer the two tiers with the 41% fixed revenue. One of the reasons is that gives the low water use people, or, you know, classically the low income people in town, people who are getting hurt by a lot of this inflation, it gives them a break. It transfers a lot more cost to the high use water user, but that's obviously people who can afford it. I mean, they're using it, they're paying a lot of money already. And it also, the two tier is, I think, particularly desirable in the fact that, like has already been stated, it makes it really, really clear to the user, whoops, I went into tier 2, and the reason I'm paying a ridiculous amount of money for that water is because I'm making us go over the allocation and having to help pay the GA fees. Now, and what I'm going to address with the district next week in a letter, because I won't physically be here, but the conservation needs to be a really big deal. And I think if I was one of those guys and all of a sudden I'm paying $8 per 100 cubic feet for water, I'd be looking for ways to conserve, cut back seriously, big time. Now, they're a small percentage of users, but they're also a large, user per user, large 100 cubic foot per month user. So small cutbacks on those guys could give you a lot of conservation in your water use, and that folds over to the whole GA problem and basin supply problem and everything, just simply beyond this. So that's why I prefer that particular structure.
And just to let you know, Mike, the high users, it's 22% of the water cells are in the high use tier.
And you might recall that this was specifically something that we wanted to look at as a way to shift the GSA fees over to the folks that are creating the need for imported water. So, yeah, I'm with you. I kind of like what it turned out to as well. Okay, well, Mark, thank you very much. I think there's probably going to be some pop-up questions as we continue consider your comments and discussion today coming up over the next week or so, but I think we're probably good with this topic at this point.
I've got a couple.
And maybe a couple of closing comments by somebody you may have heard from earlier today. Mel,
I've got their top level comments. one of the things we were directed to do by the board was to see what we could do to lower the cost to the current Tier 1 users, which are 1 through 9. And I guess, we normally say, lower the fixed fee, but it doesn't matter. It's the total fee that's really the issue. And so we need to give that a lot of thought, because that's the direction we were given. I appreciated your comments on conservation and elimination of the Tier 4 thing. But we didn't talk about separating the CII, that is commercial, industrial, institutional, from the residential, which is one of the things that we said we needed to do. And also, what are we going to do about the landscape meters? With the new state laws, when they finally get defined, they're going to be for indoor use and outdoor use, we assume, but the onus is going to be put on the water district to actually meet the requirement, not the individual residents. But we need to understand how to handle that. And we need to continue to look at the tiers, the tier lengths. I'm not satisfied that 17,000 square feet that we used before was correct. But we can continue to look at that as we go. In the meantime, I had sent a email to Don Zadiba asking for the specific costs for tiers, that is the tier parameters, as well as the water pumping, or the total water use, and the I think it was the total fees that we were receiving. Don's got the email that he can send you. There's just some details. I've been trying to model all of these various things, and I got a template that makes it very easy to do, but I've got to have the parameters to do it. So if you could make sure that Don and Ty get those numbers, I'd appreciate it. Also, I sent to Don a table associated with the amount of water used and the income donated by various tiers, that I think will give the board a better idea of who is actually paying for what water, and he can transfer that to you as well, because I'd like to see that table filled out. And I guess that was all my comments I had.
Happy to help out.
Anybody else?
More of just where are we going from here? I guess that's what I'm trying to look at. I mean, this is something that we feel is ready to take to the board next week, but of course.
In general, is there support for the two-tier? Because I agree with Mark, legally it's defensible. Mm-hmm. It puts the onus to pay the fees on those that are using the water outside the allocation. So when we had a conversation, staff with Mark, I mean, we were all aligned with the fact that the two tiers seem to be an equitable way to go. And it does, as you see, it does reduce the costs for those that are using the waters within the allocation. It does reduce that cost, which achieves the objective you wanted. Mm-hmm. But as far as, trying to pull out real low users and trying to make a break for them, like I said, you can't really subsidize them at all. You have to make it fair, equitable to everybody, and defensible. And I think what Mark has done accomplishes those objectives.
And it's the cost of providing the water. It's not the impact on the user. It's the cost of providing the water that we're managing. And it's the only thing we can manage and legally defend. No, I'm with you. I like the two-tier approach as well. I was a little surprised that it wasn't you know, you might look at the numbers and think that, you know, 30% is a huge bump, but quite frankly, the folks that are accustomed to spending 200 and plus dollars a month, it's,
Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
I-
well,
I
we
sus-
really do have to look at the numbers. That's the
Yeah.
whole issue. And I guess in my mind, the biggest problem with the two-tier, and I think it might be what Mike was pointing out earlier, is the higher the fixed fee, the lower that single flat fee becomes. And what that does is put the biggest burden on tier one users, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. So in order to make it viable, we may have to reduce that fixed fee down to something that our standard tier one users can afford. And of course, again, it goes back to the numbers. Until we get the numbers, we can't really. I like the concept, but the concept has to work. And,
Again, if
and
you
I'm
look
not, I'm
look
not
at Mark's
convinced that
chart-
it's there yet.
Look at pages 15 and 16, again, remind you that the lower the fixed, the lower that we have fixed costs, I mean, you're introducing a higher level of variability in our revenue, and we do have, like Mark said, the actual would be 97% would be covering our actual fixed costs. We're lowering it to 61%. To go to 40%, I think would be
Yeah,
irresponsible.
but see, my issue is not the district. My issue is our ratepayers.
Well, your
And,
issue should be with the
there's a
district.
balance that we have to achieve, and we need to look at what that balance is going to be.
The board needs to make sure this district is financially viable.
Absolutely, that
That's the
is critical.
priority.
But it doesn't mean that we want to make any of our people on Social Security bankrupt either. There's a balance, so.
page 19, the increase to the low use,
Pardon?
page 19.
Page 19.
We got the increase to the low use of 1.8%.
86 cents.
And it actually goes down for medium and average use.
I don't see any reason to work the numbers any harder than that, Stan.
Oh, I
That's-
do. I'm sorry, that is the tip of the iceberg. I disagree. I can show you
Okay.
what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I just want to remind it that, I know what Stan's saying, but regardless of water use, my department has a job to do, and it costs money, and that's what that 60% is, and well, technically 90%. So,
Yep, understand. Well, I, for one, think we're probably ready to take it in front of the board. Do you need a nomination, or do you need a decision, or?
No, I think we just put it on the agenda and then.
I think the
have
board
more
is
discussion.
expecting it next week. It's,
Yeah,
and we can have more discussion then, I guess.
yeah. Don, can you make sure that that information that I asked for, I get in the near future so I can actually do some work before the board meeting on Monday?
Yeah.
Okay, without any further questions for Mark, I'm going to let you go home. It's Miller time, Mark.
Yeah. And if you haven't voted, make sure you get out and vote.
I guess you are home, so
Yeah.
Miller time. You
Give
might
me
be
a
having
call
Miller
and
time as
I'll
we're talking
tell
to
you who
you.
you can vote for.
Okay.
Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Okay, in the interest of time, we'll shift to a discussion on financial statements. Oh, sorry?
Oh, we still got more things to do, huh?
We do. Mr. Neal, we still have unfinished business here, please. Thank you. Item number 5, financial statements. Mr. Ty.
Okay, through October, we had a budget number for revenue of 6 million. We're coming in below that at 277,000 below at 5.7 million. Of course, due to conservation. Expenditures, we're at a budget of 6.1 million and we're coming in at just over 6 million. So that's 106,000 less than budget. So our net right now is a negative 262,000 versus the budget of a negative 91,000. So this is something we got to keep an eye on. Of course, I don't want to say hurrying, but any way we can advance the process or the progress for the rate changes only helps this number.
Because
earlier
the
we
current
can-
rate structure is not,
It's not keeping up right now.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So we're going to keep an eye on that as we go along. Capital expenditures of 1.77 million versus, or of that, 1.28 million is the COP funded projects. And we have debt service principal of 370,000.
okay.
And then we have lovely charts.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Yep, considering, but,
And that's without an increase. Oh, I say without an increase in fees, we're doing very well. Although I don't, but we haven't actually started spending a lot of the cash capital.
right.
that we were going to spend, and so I guess to some extent, do we have a schedule for spending I mean, there were a plethora of stuff, you know, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000
Yeah, we
stuff.
just by the year.
And it was supposed to be for 23. We're in
We're
23.
in 23 and those projects are in process right now. So like, I think we've even already started some work on the Springer line as far as design. But the projects that were listed in the capital improvement plan for 2023, of course, we're almost halfway, well, we're a third of the way through 2023.
There were a number of laterals, one for 700,000, one for 200,000, and one for 100,000. I mean, that's amounts to $1 million. Have we started those?
Not the lateral replacements. We haven't started those.
Oh, okay. Well, that was my question is we've got in our capital budget, we've got those things. So the fact that this looks good.
Capital projects will not appear on the expenditure revenue report. So this 1.7 million that we have spent for capital expenditures is not included in the numbers up above. This is a profit loss up above. You may be more familiar with profit loss. Capital is not an expenditure.
Okay, yeah, you're right there. Okay. But it would go into capital expenditures.
It's in capital expenditures and eventually, once those projects are finished, then it moves over into the depreciation side, which you do see.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
okay,
So, and
I
the
got your point.
majority of that 1.28 million is
Yeah,
still coming from the COP.
okay, got it.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you for that. And how about accounts payable?
Okay, accounts payable. The first set on the second page, we have 23,605 to Ramble. And I believe that's for the I can't remember what it's called, seismic lines. That's the word I'm looking for, right?
Well, yeah.
Seismic data let's see, the following page, we have Acremax. Anyways, that's 13,000, that's for coating the roofs of, some of the arsenic. Yeah. Some of the sites. I got Aqua JPIA for 65,000, that's the insurance. Krager and Stewart, 32,000 for engineering assistance. And we got a doozy from McMurtry, Hartsock, Worth, and St. Lawrence at 103,000.
But keep in mind that that includes Providence bills through McMurtry, as does some of Chuck Krieger's work.
Gotcha. Still a doozy. Let's see, the following page. We have Water Smart software at 21,000. That's our annual subscription for that software as a service. The next set, the second accounts payable run on the second page, we have Parker groundwater for 12,000. And then on the following page, another Aqua invoice for 24,655. Banner Bank, which is the escrow for RSH construction, is 16,762. Then RSH construction for 318,487, and that's for tanks and booster, gateway booster. For September.
And those will be winding down now, right? Or, no? Still gonna-
No, they'll keep going for a while.
Okay.
And for this one, I do need a motion,
Okay.
recommendation, a recommendation motion
And the motion is to present this to the board
for approval, hopefully.
for approval. I'll make that a motion. Do I have a second? Second. Thank you, Stan. Any questions on accounts payable, Stan, or others? Okay, future agenda items.
Yeah, just Mike Neal again. I can't help being curious here. You got on October 22, accounts payable on the bottom, there's wage garnishment, 300 something. Is the district garnishing people's wages?
If required by the IRS or other federal organizations, yes.
Oh, I got you.
Or
Okay.
state.
Okay.
Okay, any comments about future agenda items? Hearing and seeing none, we'll call the meeting at 4:25.